Okay, folks, thank you all for coming. In case you wonder, remember, tomorrow's a holiday. Housekeeping isn't here, so we have to have the Tripoli tables up. But folks, you only need 2 Tripoli tables. You don't need to worry about the other 2. Unless something, maybe, I don't know what's going on most of the time. So, since we have so many new residents, we're so glad to have you here that you don't know Todd's background. Well, let's put it this way. Todd, undergrad at Waynesburg. No.
That's okay.
Where?
I'll correct you.
Where?
You keep going, I will correct you.
He did his master's and doctorate at Ivy Leagues. That's one way to get around which one it was. It could have been Harvard or Yale. One for one, one for the other. He was a professor of history at Community College of Beaver County. Got tired of Butler, Beaver.
Go on, keep on going.
CCBC. Okay. You know, and for all those years I introduced you and you never corrected me. Did you correct Paul Collier?
No, never.
Those of you who've been here for a long time, Paul Collier. Anyways, then he got tired of grading blue books and teaching a bunch of kids that could give a darn. And so he left and created the Veterans Breakfast Club. He's the executive director. It's an international organization now, isn't it? Mm-hmm. He takes veterans to Normandy, to Serbia, Vietnam, so all over the world. And he comes to the nursing homes, of which he likes us the best. We are the best. We pay the most attention. And so we just love having him here. And you new residents are in for a treat, and you will never again miss one of his lectures. So here's Todd. Oh, he lives in Mount Lebanon, grew up in Mount Lebanon. He has a wife, 2 kids, daughters. One's in Chicago. Wife just retired.
And he's a famous author, too.
He's a famous author of Post.
Yeah, thank you. You know, Paul Collier gave the introductions a lot better. Because when Paul Collier...
Mine were more inventive.
Paul Collier was a little bit more confused than Pam. So he would introduce me as having won the Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer Prize. I loved it. I never corrected Paul. So tomorrow is the 4th of July, Independence Day. And so I thought it would be appropriate to give a talk, 8 things you should know about July 4th that you might not know. On the drive over here, however, I was thinking that maybe this should be titled, Todd Ruins Another Holiday. Because I'm just thinking, like, you know, we talked about Christmas, it's not in the Bible, Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims aren't important, George Washington's birthday, he wasn't born on that day, Valentine's Day, there was no St. Valentine, Memorial Day should always be May 30th. You know, I'm always kind of throwing these, using the holidays to, I'm working on ruining St. Patrick's Day and Halloween, so be ready for that. But before I get to this talk, I do want to alert you that today came out a really big, beautiful, wonderful article on the history of the Vietnam War, profiling some of our local Vietnam veterans. It's by Laura Malt Schneiderman, and it went live on the internet today. I knew she was up to something. I referred her to many veterans to interview for this article. I didn't know it would be this in-depth and this well done, and it's extremely well done. It'll be in the print edition on Sunday, and one of the veterans profiled is our own Rose Gantner, and there she is. Look at that. Rose smiled more than anybody who had to serve a year in Vietnam. Here she is again, smiling. Here she is again, looking at her old letters that she wrote back home. I encourage you all to read it and ask Rose about her service in Vietnam. Thank you, Rose. Okay, first thing you need to know about the 4th of July is our country did not declare independence on July 4th, 1776. We declared it on July 2nd. July 2nd is when the Continental Congress voted to separate from Great Britain. It's when they voted to approve the Lee resolution, which had been introduced by Richard Henry Lee, who was a delegate from Virginia. He would have been like Robert E. Lee's first cousin once removed, I believe. The Lee resolution just called for the United Colonies to separate from Great Britain. It was introduced on July 7th. It was debated one day, July 1st, and it was unanimously approved with one abstention on July 2nd. So July 2nd truly is our Independence Day, not July 4th. When John Adams wrote his wife, he wrote this: "The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." He was very enthused about it, but he thought it would happen July 2nd. So we should be celebrating July 2nd. What happened on July 4th was that the Continental Congress voted to approve the Declaration of Independence as the list of reasons why the United States was separating from Great Britain. It was the approval of the declaration of the document itself that happened on July 4th. Nobody signed it on July 4th. This picture is incorrect. Nobody signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. It was signed many different days. One day when about 30 delegates signed it, was August 2nd. Some people signed it in November. One person signed it in January 1777. Maybe one or two people signed the back of it in 1781. There was no ceremony to it. There was no moment when they were all lined up. Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant man. He was probably the greatest mathematician in the world. Truly, I mean, definitely top 3 in the world at the time. True genius, but he was absolutely wrong when he said in 1819, when John Trumbull painted this picture, Jefferson said, "Yeah, this is exactly what it was like. This is perfect." And Jefferson was a little bit confused about the subject matter too. He thought that this was depicting the signing of the Declaration, and it wasn't. This is depicting the presentation of the delivery of the Declaration of Independence to the Congress on June 28th, 1776, so that they could read it, the Congress could read it and debate it, and then vote up or down. When Trumbull painted this in 1819, many years later, the country was in kind of a nationalistic fever and a great kind of revival of interest in the Revolutionary War, and especially the Declaration of Independence and Independence Day. But by 1819, 2 men who were part of this committee that delivered the Declaration to the Congress, John Adams, depicted here, and Thomas Jefferson, depicted here, had a major falling out, as you know, major conflict between them. And Trumbull, it has often been noted that Trumbull seems to make a comment on that falling out by having Jefferson step on Adams' foot right here. See it right there. In the 1820s, when people started paying attention to Independence Day and the Declaration of Independence, all kinds of stories started to emerge about when everybody signed it. For example, John Hancock has the famous big signature, and it was often said that he said, "There, I guess King George will be able to read that all the way across the ocean." He never said that. That was made up in the 1820s. Also made up was when John Hancock said, "We must now all hang together," and Ben Franklin smartly replied, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall hang separately." Unfortunately, they never said that. I find this really interesting, this little piece of information about the Declaration. The Declaration's most famous sentence was partially written by Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin inserted one word that I think made a lot of difference. Franklin. Okay, let me just explain this committee. The Committee of Five. On June 11th, the Continental Congress appointed 5 members, 5 delegates, to be the Committee of Five. And their job was to write up a list of grievances against the Crown to justify the Declaration of Independence. This is why we're declaring independence. That's what the Committee of Five was tasked to do. Ben Franklin was on this committee. The committee was Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, and then 2 people we've never heard of. And so Franklin was by far, he was really the only celebrity in the Continental Congress. And he was an international celebrity. Benjamin Franklin was world famous. Everybody knew who he was, unlike the other members of the Congress. He was also much older than everybody else. He was 70 years old. Thomas Jefferson was 33. And so everybody deferred the whole time to Franklin. When Franklin opened his mouth, everybody shut up and listened. So Franklin was on this committee, and he said to the committee, look, I am by far the best writer of this group. He said, and I could easily write this Declaration of Independence, but I will not, because I hate to have my writing edited by anyone. And this declaration is going straight to a group of 56 people who are going to tear it apart. And so I will not sign my name to anything that anybody else is going to change. So I hand it to you, John Adams, to write it. Yeah, and Adams said, well, I am also maybe the second best writer in this group. But Adams did very generously say, Jefferson, you're a better writer than I am. But he said, I think Jefferson should be the writer. And for two reasons. Number one, Adams was not well liked by other people. Jefferson was unknown to most people. Jefferson was not famous yet. He was 33 years old. He had been a delegate in the Virginia state legislature. He'd been very active in the state legislature, behind the scenes doing writing. Nobody remembered him ever speaking, ever, and I don't think he ever spoke during the legislature in the years that he was in the Virginia legislature. Very shy, yes?
Was he an alternate?
In the Virginia Burgesses? An alternate?
To the Congress?
I don't believe he was an alternate to the Congress. No, I think he was a regular, one of the original delegates. And he was people remembered him, very few people knew him, but people who knew him knew he was a wonderful, brilliant mind and writer, but he was so strange. He was so introverted. He was so shy. He never spoke. He was always in his own head. And so people didn't really know who he was. He certainly wasn't a household name. But, so he wasn't disliked. Everybody knew who Adams was. And nobody liked him. Because he was like Hamilton. He was abrasive. He was, But Adams also said this, and he was absolutely right. He said, we have to have a Virginian write this. Virginia's population was as big as every other state combined. Virginia's wealth was as much as every other state combined. If Virginia wasn't taking the lead on independence, independence would not happen. They also thought it wouldn't be smart to have a celebrity like Franklin write the Declaration. Much better to have it come from an unknown, so it could almost appear like it's a voice of the people. So Jefferson was assigned the task to write the Declaration. He retired to an apartment in Philadelphia, and he spent about a week and a half working on it. Then he presented it to not the entire committee, because he didn't know the 2 other guys, or didn't think them worthy of the criticism, and he took it straight to Adams and Franklin. And Franklin and Adams read it, And Franklin immediately said, oh boy, this is going to cause a big problem, because Jefferson exceeded the mandate. The mandate was write up a list. Write up a list of problems that you have with the crown. Keep it simple. Describe why we're separating, what our grievances are. Jefferson took the opportunity instead to write a grand, abstract, philosophical treatise on human rights and human freedom and human equality. This was way beyond and not expected. And Franklin immediately knew that there were going to be problems here. And one problem that Franklin thought that would encounter would be this sentence. This is what Jefferson wrote: "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." He thought, the word undeniable, he said, is a word that when you use it, you invite people to deny it. And the word sacred has a theological weight. And we have a room of 56 people, all educated theologians, who are going to be debating this to no end, whether this truth is sacred or not. Let's eliminate the religious component, and let's refer to Enlightenment reason, which was very popular in the 1770s. The idea was this, the Enlightenment reason, the idea was this: if anyone can think clearly and properly by using their reason, they can see the truth of the world, just by thinking properly. And so, if you see the issue clearly, it is self-evident that all men are created equal. I'm here to tell you, of all the truths in the world, all men being created equal is probably the least self-evident there is. I mean, come on. This is the most ridiculous statement you could ever make. You know, people are born all over the spectrum in terms of abilities and backgrounds and parentage. I mean, you name it. So Jefferson must have been talking about something else, some other kind of fundamental equality that's maybe more abstract. And he was, and I do want to mention that later on. But I thought also I would play just a 3-minute clip from a wonderful series you might remember on HBO from 2008, the John Adams series. And Paul Giamatti plays John Adams. And I just want to play the clip where Jefferson delivers the Declaration to Franklin and Adams. They read it and start criticizing it. And it's a very short clip, but I think I love the way that they draw Franklin as being the charismatic, the charismatic person everybody refers to, and Jefferson as being the introspective thinker that he was.
This is something altogether unexpected. Not only a declaration of our independence, but of the rights of all men. This is well said, sir. Very, very well said. The Christian king of Great Britain has waged cruel war against human nature itself, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere.
Yes, you lay the evils of slavery at the feet of the king, but you say nothing of slavery itself, sir. Now, surely, if the trade is outlawed but ownership is not, then those unfortunate Negroes still in servitude will become a more lucrative commodity.
Well, that's not what I intended, Dr. Franklin. Slavery is an abomination and must be loudly proclaimed as such, but I own that neither I nor any man has any immediate solution to the problem.
Well, tis no matter. The issue before us is independence and not emancipation.
Dr. Franklin, this document is...
Is something our friends in the Congress will debate, but I would be very surprised if they will countenance an attack on slavery. Now, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal, etc. Sacred and undeniable. Smacks of the pulpit.
Does it?
These truths are self-evident, are they not?
Perhaps.
Self-evident then. Self-evident?
Self-evident.
Do not mistake me, sir. I share your sentiment.
Every single word was precisely chosen. I assure you of that, Dr. Franklin.
Yes, but yours will not be the only hand in this document. Cannot be. They will try to mangle it, and they may succeed.
There may be expressions which I would not have inserted if I had drawn it up, but I will defend every word of it.
Well, it's what I believe.
This is a marvelous invention, Mr. Jefferson.
Yes, I went through a number of variations. This is by far the most successful. Simplest is always the best.
It's 2 seats, and the top one swivels on rollers made from the window sash pulleys.
Oh, most ingenious.
And that is accurate, that last part of the discussion. I love the way they go from, okay, well, we've polished off the Declaration of Independence, now let's talk about the swivel chair. You know, Jefferson invented the swivel chair, and Franklin and Jefferson talked much more about the swivel chair than they ever did the Declaration. They were absolutely, Franklin was absolutely smitten with the swivel chair. But I like how they draw that out, because in fact, when the Declaration was delivered to the Continental Congress, they did not like it. Congress really didn't like it, and they did tear it apart. They made 86 major edits to it, and they deleted over a quarter of it. And much of what they deleted had to do with Jefferson's most grievous accusations against King George III. And one of his major accusations was that George III was responsible for the slave trade. And American delegates in the Continental Congress didn't like this section that I'm going to show right now. They didn't like this 168 words that condemned the slave trade and condemned King George III. They didn't like this section for 2 reasons, one good and one bad. The bad reason that they didn't like it, I think, was because they thought slavery was fine. They didn't have a problem with the slave trade, they didn't have a problem with slavery, and they didn't like somebody condemning slavery so pointedly in this document. The good reason, I think, that they decided to delete this, which they did, was that Thomas Jefferson's argument that King George III was responsible for the slave trade was unconvincing. And it is unconvincing. I mean, King George III didn't cause the slave trade. The slave trade predated him, and the slave trade existed long after him. I mean, you know, he was just one small player in this global system, and it was too much to claim that that was a list of his crimes. This is what Jefferson wrote. He wrote it very well, but I think it was inaccurate. King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain. determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative, which means he has used his veto power, for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them. That is, in other words, King George III called upon slaves in North America to escape and to join the British Army and fight against the American patriots. And if they joined that fight, they would be granted their freedom. And thousands of American slaves took that offer, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. This was deleted entirely, and Jefferson never forgave them for it. He thought it was an abomination how they destroyed his Declaration. He, in fact, had printed up his original version of the Declaration. He had printed up thousands of copies and distributed them, hoping that they might become the official version. They didn't, but he absolutely took that grievance to his death. Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence, but this guy engrossed it. That means he wrote it, physically wrote it. His name is Timothy Matlack. He was a brewer, a beer bottler, an alcoholic, a gambler, a fierce opponent of slavery, and he had great handwriting. And that's why they appointed him the guy who would engross, who would write the physical declaration. And he wrote it using iron gall ink. And I've just learned this a few days ago in preparation for this talk. I was curious, what kind of ink did they use then? And it turns out iron gall ink was the predominant ink in Europe for centuries. And it's pretty simple to make, and it's wonderful ink. It still is wonderful ink. You take iron and you could just soak like iron nails in vinegar, or you could scrape a piece of iron into a solution, and then you add something called oak gall, G-A-L-L. You guys are nodding like you know what gall is. I didn't know what a gall was. I asked my wife, I'm reading about this, I'm sitting next to her, and I said, what's oak gall? And she put down what she was doing. She said, you don't know what a gall is on a tree? And I said, no, I've never heard of a gall on a tree. And she said, how do you, well, actually what I said was, I'll tell you what I really said. I said, oh, I know what it is. I'm just testing you to see if you know. And she saw right through that and said something like, how do you know so much about stuff you care about and nothing about anything else? It's just amazing. And she described to me what a gall was. A gall wasp will burrow into an oak tree, and the oak will defend itself by kind of smothering with sap, and it'll create a ball that you could pick and dry and crush into a powder, add to iron, and make this wonderful ink that was used in the Declaration of Independence. The ink was heavy soaking ink on this parchment right here. This is the original. This is the original that Timothy Matlack wrote on. It's, to give you perspective, 24 inches wide, 30 inches long. It's sheepskin parchment, and he deliberately wrote with a very heavy hand because they wanted to make copies. And the way you made copies with iron gall ink, this is something that I just discovered, I never knew this, is you take a piece of paper or parchment and you wet it, soak it, lay it over the original, press it, and the ink will be sucked out of the original into the wet piece of paper. You pull the piece of paper up and then you read it backwards. So this is a copy made from the original. And that's why the original is so faded. This is not sun damage, which is what I always thought it was. It is, the ink has been sucked out of it by making copies. All right. The 4th of July, Independence Day, was not much celebrated in this country for the first couple decades of our history. There just wasn't much to celebrate. as we know, we've been talking about Hamilton, we've talked about the Whiskey Rebellion, Shays Rebellion, the quasi-war with France, the Jay Treaty, almost going to war with Great Britain, the election of 1800. There were so many crises in the early decades of our republic that a lot of Americans doubted that the Union would last. Moreover, and this is more important, a lot of Americans doubted that the Union should last. Many Americans, including, as we've talked extensively here, people living in Western Pennsylvania, they weren't thrilled with the Union. They weren't happy with the US Constitution. They didn't expect this thing called the United States of America to last. And so there wasn't really a lot of good feeling about celebrating Independence Day in the original, independence from Great Britain. That changed with the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was the second War of Independence with Great Britain. Great Britain eventually in this war threw everything they had at the US and could not defeat the US a second time. And this was a war fought to a draw. It was a stalemate. But for the Americans, the stalemate was a victory. We were still standing. Think about our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, written by Francis Scott Key after he saw the Battle of Fort McHenry, September 13th, 1814. The British fleet arrives in the Chesapeake Bay and pummels the fort, expecting it to fall, and it doesn't fall. And by dawn's early light, they see that the American flag is still flying. The British haven't conquered this fort. And that was so symbolic to Americans at the time. Like, they hit us with everything they had, and we're still here. And so when the peace was signed in 1815 and the war ended, Americans were resigned to the fact that the United States of America was not going anywhere, that this union was going to last into the future. And so there was like this upswell of patriotism and of nationalism that really expressed itself by 1819, 1820s or so. So in 1815, you begin to see some celebrations of Independence Day. And here is Philadelphia's first celebration was in 1819 of Independence Day. They didn't celebrate it before then, but here in 1819 they did. And they did largely as celebrating the victory in the War of 1812. The big celebration, the real turning point came on the 50th anniversary of the 4th of July. July 4th, 1826 was the 50th anniversary, and it was helped by the fact that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had the good sense to die on that day. And so it seemed like Providence had said that this should be a day that should be celebrated up and down. The day itself was celebrated, and this is so important. The fact of independence was celebrated in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s. But what wasn't celebrated was the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was not a favorite document in our early history right up through the Civil War because it was too controversial. Think about that significant sentence. That sentence, you just could not get around it. People didn't quote it. People didn't revere it. You don't see it in much literature at all. The only people who quoted and celebrated, I'm gonna offend a lot of people here. Okay. The only people who celebrated and quoted the Declaration of Independence were lunatics, like women demanding equality, like abolitionists demanding the end of slavery. They quoted it left and right. They thought it was the greatest document ever. All men are created equal. We're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty. Feminists made a huge deal out of the Declaration of Independence. The rest of the country just tried to ignore it. You couldn't find a copy of it in many states in the South because it just seemed to endorse the principle of human freedom too much. And then in the North, in New England, it also seemed to endorse this right of secession, that we have a right to overthrow, our government or separate from a state that we don't want to, be a part of. So it's a revolutionary document, and revolutionary documents are unsettling. And the only prominent American, or the first prominent American, to insist on bringing the Declaration of Independence back to the fore of our founding concept was this man, Abraham Lincoln. He's responsible for it. And he did it in a very dramatic and controversial way on November 19th, 1863. He had been planning this, it turns out, and he gave a speech whose opening words were controversial. If you were to ask most Americans in 1863, when was this country founded? They would say 1787, when the Constitution was written. Or maybe 1789, when the Constitution was ratified. If you were to ask most Americans, what's our founding document? They would say the United States Constitution. I mean, that's our founding document. If you were to ask Abraham Lincoln publicly in 1862, he would absolutely have said the US Constitution. He was a constitutional lawyer. In the early years of the Civil War, he justified the Union cause exclusively in constitutional terms. That's it. He was just enforcing the regulations and the constraints imposed by the United States Constitution. This was a war over union. And then something happened. In 1863, he seemed to change his mind. And he gave this speech. And the speech was stunning. And if you read responses to the speech, like around the country, a lot of people are saying, wow, where did he pull this date out from? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 80 is 87 years ago. 87 years ago in 1868 was 1776. He's saying that our nation was founded in 1776, not 1787 or 1789. Why does that matter? Because he is saying that our country was founded on the principle of human equality and human liberty. This was unique. This was a first. And he really, just in the snap of a finger, kind of changed how we view our history and how we view, I think, ourselves. And what he was arguing was that the Civil War was a second founding. We were going back to the original vision of our founders in 1776. This war was giving us a new birth of freedom. That's how he put it. And this was quite revolutionary. When I would teach this, not at Community College at Beaver County, Pam. It was Penn State Beaver and Waynesburg University. That's what you meant to say. When I would teach those kids, I would say, like, this came out of nowhere. You know, there was very little in Lincoln's background that would suggest such a radical idea coming from a pretty moderate and level-headed attorney. But I was wrong. If I were to teach that now, I would teach it very differently. Just from a few biographies I've read of Lincoln, one studied extensively a wonderful speech that he gave in 1854 in Peoria, Illinois, long before the Civil War, long before he was president, long before he had even run for the US Senate. And it reads in part like a first draft of the Gettysburg Address. 9 years earlier, this is what he says. Nearly 80 years ago, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. But now from that beginning, we have run down to the other declaration, that for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of self-government. Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us re-purify it. Let us re-adopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it, the practices and policy which harmonize with it. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we shall have saved it as to make it and keep it forever worthy of saving. That is absolutely expresses, I think, the sentiments and the principles of the Gettysburg Address and what ended up defining the meaning of the Civil War. But it also gets at this other issue, going back to the Revolution, of what made the American Revolution revolutionary. I would argue that it was the Declaration of Independence. And historians today still debate very much, and have for a long time, 100 years at least, was that war that we fought between 1775 and 1783, was it a war of independence, or was it the American Revolution? The predominant opinion, not a huge majority, but the predominant opinion among professional historians is that it was a war of independence. It was not a revolution. Because I think most people, when they think revolution, what do you think? Especially anybody here born and raised in Europe? Because I want to pick on you if you were. No? I hear this from European historians all the time. I remember in graduate school all the time. Like, you guys think you had a revolution. You don't know what a revolution is. We know how to do revolutions. You set up a guillotine, you cut off heads, you put the heads on spikes, on pikes. If there's a czar, you line up the family, you kill them all. I mean, revolutions are bloody, they're dramatic, you know when they start and you know when they end. And they're a fundamental transformation of the society and culture and politics and economy of a nation. That's a revolution. Your revolution was hardly revolutionary. And in a sense, they're right. But it's a different kind of, what I would argue back, is that, and still argue back, is that, well, it's a different kind of revolution. It's not the revolution of the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, but it was a revolution. And it did change American society fundamentally. What happened was, I think, is that something happened in this country between 1775 and 1783 that fundamentally changed what our country was about. It changed the minds and hearts of the people. And in fact, John Adams says this. He says this years later. He's writing to a friend. What do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. I think he absolutely has it. He noted that something had changed during the 1770s, 1780s, that we had gone from one kind of a society to another. And it wasn't all at once. It was gradual. It wasn't complete. It was not complete. It wasn't a total revolution. In fact, that observation is made really well by Benjamin Rush, the doctor from Philadelphia who was a patriot. He said at the end of the American Revolution, the American War is over. But this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of this great drama is closed. That's key. The revolution is ongoing. It's slow burning. And it will continue to transform our country. And I absolutely believe that that's what has been happening in our country for the past 250 years. A transformation that began in the 1770s. And I want to talk a little bit about how the 1770s changed American society by telling the story of this guy that you've probably never heard of. You shouldn't have heard of him. His name is George Robert Twelves Hughes. He was a funny little man with a funny big name. He was 5'1". He was born very poor. His father was a chandler or a candle maker in Boston. He himself would become a shoemaker, poor shoemaker his entire life. He had a great mind, I think, a charismatic personality, very funny man. He had 15 children with one wife. God bless the wife. He said he had 15 children. He named the first 10, Sarah, Mary, Richard, James, John. And then he said, after 10, we ran out of names. So he named his 11th child 11. And his 12th child 12. And they did not think it was funny at all. He was poor his whole life, and we would not know anything about him except on July 4th, 1832, he's living in Richfield Springs, New York, which is near Cooperstown, New York. He's old, he's retired. In those days, he was so poor. That's why you have 15 kids, because when you grow old, you just live with them. And he would live with one until they got sick of him and then pass him to another, So at this time, in 1832, July 4th, he was living with a son in Richfield Springs. And Richfield Springs was turning out for a big, 4th of July celebration. And out came George wearing his Massachusetts militia uniform from the 1770s. And man, people fell in love with him. I mean, he was just mobbed as the celebrity of the day. And there were a couple journalists there, one named James Hawes was there, and sat him down and interviewed him. And this is a story totally after my own heart, because you know that I direct the Veterans Breakfast Club, and that's what we do. We talk with veterans and have them share stories. And so I could absolutely see myself just sitting at the feet of George Robert Twelves Hughes and listening to the stories that he told. And the stories that he told were unbelievable, literally unbelievable. I mean, he said, for example, that he was 100 years old, and that was not true. He was 90, off by 10. He said he was the last living Revolutionary War veteran from Boston, and he wasn't. There were others still alive. The journalist started asking him, well, you grew up in Boston, so you must remember, like, the Boston Massacre? And he said, remember it? I was there. I caused it. The Boston Massacre was caused by an apprentice who went to an officer to collect a debt, and the officer pushed him away, and the apprentices started throwing snowballs, and then the whole thing escalated. He said, yeah, I was like throwing snowballs at the officer. I got butted in the shoulder with a rifle and broke my shoulder. He was asked, well, were you there for the Boston Tea Party? Was I there? I ran it. I mean, I was a platoon leader. I knew how to whistle. I was dressed like a Mohawk Indian. We threw $1 million worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. Yeah, it was, I was there for that. Were you there for the siege of Boston and for the British occupation of Boston and Lexington and Concord and the battle that took place, around Boston? Yeah, I was on the front lines. I mean, I was there. I was one of the first soldiers, he said, to meet General George Washington when Washington came up from Virginia to take over our little militia and make it a continental army. I had dinner with George Washington the first week he was there in July 1775. He tells all these crazy, he says, they say, well, were you Boston became the hub of privateering. A privateer is a nice word for a pirate. And privateers would take their own private ships out. They would try and capture British cargo ships, steal the cargo, and give it to the Patriot cause. He said, oh yeah, I was a sailor. I was on a privateer. We captured 2 British ships. I was took in captivity and escaped. All these tall tales that all turned out to be true. Every one of them was true. It's really remarkable. He had been in all those places. He had done all those things. And there were 2 wonderful books written about him. I imagine they have not been brought back into print. They should be, because they're really well written, and it's such a great source of material. Here's a voice from pre-revolutionary America. And he's a charismatic voice. He's a funny voice. You really get the sense, I mean, no offense, Alex McClinchy, but he's like a Revolutionary War version of you. Kind of crotchety, and, hard to deal with, and Marines can take it. They're used to that kind of. But it's true. It is like he's like one of these characters who comes to our Veterans Breakfast Club, just really funny and full of these great stories and full of wonderful insights. And in his books, he is very clear that he's speaking to the youth. He wants the youth to know what it was like before the revolution. You have no idea, he says, what it was like to live in America in the 1760s. Very different, he said, than it is today. And he gave examples. He said, you know, you'd be walking down the street as a poor kid in Boston, and you'd look up and you'd see somebody who was upper class walking the other way. And you'd know he was upper class by how he was dressed. And when he was coming your way, you would have to step into the street, into the mud. You'd have to take off your hat, and you'd have to bow until he passed. And you would never speak to him. You would never look him in the eye. And if you didn't do any of those things, if you didn't tip your hat, you could be arrested for it, for kind of insubordination. And he was describing a very typical kind of interaction in colonial America, because colonial America was very hierarchical. It was very, top down. This pyramid, this simple pyramid, I think is a good way of illustrating how the stratification of American society during the colonial period. Most Americans fell into this lower class here that I call a servant class. There were slaves in colonial America, in New England, colonial New England, but there were a lot of other people in the servant class too. There were servants, there were apprentices. George Robert Twelves Hughes was an apprentice to a shoemaker. He didn't like his apprentice, he didn't like his master, so he ran away, and he was caught by law enforcement and brought back. You weren't allowed to run away. You were property of your master as an apprentice. Women were owned by their fathers until they got married, and then they were owned by their husbands. The husbands did everything for them. Women could not sign a contract. They couldn't own property. They couldn't testify in court. Men would do that on their behalf, and men controlled their labor. So most Americans fell into the servant class with no rights whatsoever. And then you have this interesting middle class, this artisan class, these craftsmen. These are the shoemakers, the blacksmiths, the silversmiths, the wheelwrights, the brewers. They're also like the small farmers. These people are independent artisans and farmers. They own property. They even have servants. They have children whose labor that they direct. And they have wives whose labor that they direct. They can do a lot of things that the people in the servant class can't do. For example, in some towns they could vote, but they can't hold office. They can't be an officer in the militia. They can't be judges. There's a ceiling to how much power and how much say they have. And they always have to defer to those in the upper class. And the upper class is small and exclusive. And it's made up of the large landholders and the large merchants who own most of the property. And they, the upper class, make the decisions for everybody else. They hold all the offices, and they make all the political decisions on how the colony is going to be run. And you defer to them because they know better, and because they rule for the good of everybody, is what they say. And you defer to them in politics, and you also defer to them when you see them by tipping your hat and not speaking directly to them. And you have to, in such a society, you have to know at a glance who is who. When you're walking down the street, you have to be able to look up and see right away, should I tip my hat? Should I bow to this person? And so there are strict regulations about what you wear, how you dress. Those in the upper class dress in expensive clothing. They have silk stockings, velvet jackets, brass or silver buttons, crenulated, collars and cuffs, and powdered wigs. Wigs are a really big part of it. We've talked a lot about wigs here, and here's what a person like George Robert Twelves Hughes would dress like. Up there, that's Paul Revere. He was a silversmith. He was a craftsman, a member of that middle tier of society. This is what that's John Hancock there. This is what the upper class would dress like. And wigs were a big part of it. I mean, that's why powdered wigs and powdered hair in general was so important in colonial America, because you could see from, all the way down the street who has the powdered hair, and you know that you have to defer to them. So this was what colonial American society was like. On January 25th, 1774, George Robert Twelves Hughes, and he tells this story in his book, he says, I'm walking down the street and I encounter, he calls him, a big wig. Guy wearing a wig. And this guy wearing a wig is John Malcolm, and he is well known and not well liked in Boston. He's a custom official, and he's a merchant. He's a guy, in the merchant class. George walks up and sees this guy, John Malcolm, beating a child with his cane. Because the child, we don't quite know what the child did. He may have slid into him with a sled. He may have called him a name. He may have not bowed to him or something like that. We don't quite know what the child did, but we do know that Malcolm was beating the child. And George walks up to Malcolm and says, hey, stop it. And Malcolm said, this is none of your business. Step back or you'll get a taste of this. And George says, no, step away from the child. John Malcolm takes his cane, wham, comes down on George's head, cracks his skull, knocks George out. For the rest of his life, George would like to show off the little divot he had in his skull from that cane. Malcolm goes back home. George is lying unconscious in the Boston street. And something remarkable happens. The artisans of Boston in the previous year, this is a month after the Tea Party. The artisans of Boston the previous year had been griping a lot about how they were being treated on the streets. And they were saying, we're being disrespected, we're, open violence against George on broad daylight in the streets of Boston. That's unacceptable. It's kind of the last straw. So they got together, they marched on John Malcolm's house, pulled Malcolm out of the house, and tarred and feathered him. They made him drink tea, and they made him renounce his custom office, and they demanded that he apologize to all the artisans in Boston. John Malcolm refused to do it, and so they put a rope around his neck. They paraded him through the streets. They took him to the Liberty Tree in Boston, and if you've ever been to Boston, I think it's on Washington Street, you can see a plaque in the sidewalk where the Liberty Tree, and it was a tree, was. They threw one end of the rope over the branch of the Liberty Tree, and they were prepared to commit vigilante justice right there on January 25th. And who should show up at the 11th hour but George himself, who had come to. He'd been treated by Dr. Joseph Warren, who would be the patriot doctor who would be killed in the Battle of Bunker Hill. George shows up with a bandaged head, and he says, please let this guy go. Don't kill him. Don't, two wrongs don't make a right. So they agree. The crowd agrees. They let John Malcolm go. They order that he leave town, and he does. John Malcolm leaves Boston, never comes back. He takes the next ship to England, takes it to England, and through connections gets word of what happened to him to King George III. And this becomes a major news story in Europe, in England, and in America. So this thing happens in January, but the way the news goes, it doesn't really spread until spring, till March, till April. People in Western Pennsylvania are reading about what happened to George Robert Twelves Hughes. They're reading about the tarring and feathering of John. I mean, this itself was made in commemoration of the event. That's an actual depiction of what happened. This becomes big news. And this story fuels this movement in Philadelphia, in New York, in Boston, even in Point South. A movement among this middle class, this artisan craftsman class, these small property owners who say they're mad as hell and they won't take it anymore. They found a vigilante organization called the Sons of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty start to patrol the streets to protect the rights of citizens like them. And of course, like most vigilante organizations, they take it too far. You know, they're there to prevent violence, but they start instigating violence. So for example, if they see somebody wearing a wig, they knock it off, or they'll cut the hair. You know, there's a movement against wearing finery. It becomes unfashionable to wear a wig. And if you insist on keeping with the old ways and wear a wig, then you end up either moving to Canada, moving to Great Britain, or joining the British side in the coming conflict. There are some people, however, in that elite crowd that do agree to take off their wigs. And those are the people we remember as our founding fathers. You know, people, here's another great example of a new method of macaroni making as practiced in Boston, North America. They were called bigwigs and macaroni. And macaroni because wealthy people went to Italy and fell in love with pasta, which they called macaroni. And they would come back, you'd always know a wealthy person when they ate macaroni, that meant that they were wealthy and they had been to Italy. Here's Benjamin Franklin. He was enormously wealthy. He retired at age 35, I think. Enormously wealthy. He was a poor kid, became wealthy, and he began to ape the manners of those at the very top. So he wore the silk stockings, he wore a wig, but when the revolution started, he ditched the wig, and this is how we remember him. You know, wearing a coonskin cap like an ordinary backwoods farmer. Another guy who did the same, this is Thomas Jefferson. He always wore a wig before the revolution, and he hated it. You could go to Williamsburg today into one of their stores, the shops there, and they have an account by Jefferson's account, how much money he spent on wigs and hair products, which was a lot of money, powder, pomade, wigs, and he hated it. He was fussy and he hated it. He said, he wrote, you know, he was a mathematician. And so he wrote in his journal, he actually calculated this. He said, if I live to be 80 years old, I will have spent a full 12 years in the powder room working on my hair. So he's one of these founders who stopped wearing wigs. Very ostentatiously stopped wearing wigs. This is his official White House portrait in his first term. This was controversial when it came out. The man who painted this portrait said, "Sir, don't you want to brush your hair before I paint your portrait?" And he said, "No. You know, I want to look like everybody else looks. Don't you want to wear a finer coat than what you're wearing?" No, he wore very simple clothing. And the idea was he wanted to embody the spirit of equality, of course, that he would later give such memorable expression to in the Declaration of Independence. It's this, I think it's this sentence that really has defined who we are more than any other sentence in our history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This, I think, is our founding sentence. This is the sentence that Lincoln wanted us to keep coming back to, and I think measuring ourselves against. And it's also, I think, an expression of a feeling that Americans were experiencing during the American Revolution. George Robert tells Hughes, you know, he's not that eloquent, but he tells a story in his book that I'll end on, and it's a story of how he kind of became aware and realized his own equality. He said it was 1778. He was walking down the street in Philadelphia. A big wig was walking the other way. He said he was lost in his own thoughts. He'd been away at sea. He was kind of in a bad mood. And he was lost in his own thoughts and wasn't paying attention. And he said he's walking down the street, and all of a sudden a cane is stretched horizontally in front of him, stopping him. And he looks up and he looks at this bigwig with a wig on. And the man says to him, "Aren't you going to tip your hat?" And George said, I grabbed the cane, looked him in the eye, and told him, I will never bow to another man, and kept on walking. And that, I think, is really the spirit of 1776. Thank you. I will be back for another anniversary, and this will be the 80th anniversary of VJ Day, the end of World War II, and I want to talk about that anniversary and what the end of World War II meant. All right.